On a Friday night in late March of 1980, an 83-year-old man named Harry R. Truman sat on his couch in his Washington State Lodge with a whiskey and Coke and turned on his battery-operated radio to listen to the news. And just a second or two later, he found himself having to jack up the volume of the radio because he couldn't hear it anymore because a couple of his cats in the other room were fighting and yowling and it was causing a whole commotion. Harry had lost track of how many cats he actually had, but it was a lot, maybe a dozen. And even though at this moment he yelled and cursed at them and told them to knock it off, he was actually glad they were out there with him because he liked their company. 5 years earlier, Harry's wife, Edna, had died. And since then, he had lived alone, minus all these cats. And he also didn't have a lot of neighbors either, so for the most part, he had been fairly isolated the last few years. Also, Spirit Lake, the lake that his lodge was on, was 4 hours south of the major city of Seattle, and pretty far into the wilderness. The lake did get busy in the summer with tourists, but at this time in March, there were only about 60 people that lived there, and they were very spread out. But Harry didn't really mind the solitude. He missed Edna a lot, but he had his cats, and he had his radio, and the jaw-dropping mountain scenery and lake, and he had his whiskey and Cokes. So overall, even though he was sort of a gruff guy, he was actually quite happy with his life. But just then, there was a loud knock on Harry's door. And Harry was not surprised by this. I mean, yes, he lives way out in the middle of nowhere, and he did not expect visitors, but in this case, he knew who it was. And as soon as he thought about that, his face contorted into a scowl. He was really annoyed. At this point in Harry's life, he really had only one problem. And it was a major problem, at least to him, and that was the government. And for the last few days, government agents, like almost certainly the ones that were knocking on his door, had been harassing him, trying to get him to leave his lodge and the wilderness that he loves so much because they needed to conduct some kind of federal operation and they wanted everybody to clear out. Now, Harry loved his country, and he'd even fought for it during the First World War, but he really did not like authority, and he could not tolerate being told what to do. During Prohibition, for example, which was a period of time in the 1920s when alcohol was illegal in America, Harry had simply ignored the law and made his own booze, like he just didn't care. So, over these last few days that these federal agents had come to his house trying to get him to leave, Harry had not been intimidated, he had simply stood his ground. And he figured it was really only a matter of time before the federal government sent a local police officer over in hopes that Harry would be more cooperative with somebody that he likely already knew. But what they didn't know about Harry is that Harry really didn't cooperate with anybody. Not with the government, certainly, not with local police, not with his own family, not with his friends, or not with the two ex-wives he'd been with before finding Edna. He was just somebody who marched to the beat of his own drum. So now, Harry did not get up to answer the knock at his door. Instead, he just waited until the person out there, the visitor, yelled through the door and announced who they were, and not really to Harry's surprise, it was the local deputy that Harry did know, clearly being sent here by the federal agents to try to get Harry to leave. And when Harry still didn't answer the door when the deputy clearly had announced themselves, knowing Harry would know who they were, when Harry still didn't get up, didn't answer the door, the deputy finally, just sort of frustrated, called out, "Harry, are you sure you don't want to go?" Now, even though this deputy was being a whole lot more amicable than the government agents had been, they had been really forceful, basically telling him you gotta leave, the deputy here was at least kind of giving Harry a chance to make a decision. Despite that, the question the deputy had asked just made Harry really mad, because leaving his house was just not something he would ever consider doing. Harry had lived in this lodge for 54 years, and 37 of those years were spent running this lodge as an inn, as a business, with his late wife Edna, who was the love of his life. Now, he'd let the lodge go a little after she had died, so truthfully it was kind of falling apart and it smelled terrible, because of all the cats, but it had been theirs, and now it was his, and he would never give it up. And not only that, but just outside his doorstep was Spirit Lake, which Harry believed was the most beautiful, perfect place in the entire world. It was quiet and serene and situated right at the base of some of the most breathtaking mountains he had ever seen in his whole life. And so to say Harry loved it here was a complete understatement. His lodge and Spirit Lake were basically his whole identity. Harry didn't know if he believed in God, but he did believe in the trees and the lake and the birds that screeched at him at all hours of the day. It was like his home, this area, was his religion, and he certainly was not about to give it up just because some federal authority or government agent or whoever told him to. So all Harry said to the deputy waiting outside was a very firm "good night," which Harry was actually quite proud of himself for because he had a really hard time not swearing. So this seemed pretty mild. After that, Harry waited to see if the deputy would challenge him or say anything else, but he didn't. And moments later, Harry heard the deputy's footsteps crunching down the gravel driveway and heading back towards his cruiser. After that, Harry leaned back into his couch and smiled to himself and picked up his drink, kind of toasting himself for standing his ground, and at the same time sort of hoping that maybe now, finally, officials would understand that he was not going to change his mind. But that's not what happened. A little more than a week later, on the morning of April 5th, Harry sat in a folding chair in a clearing by his house, with his binoculars pressed to his eyes and a glass of whiskey in the cup holder of his chair. This was an area of the woods near his house he called his cocktail lounge, where he'd often go to relax with a drink. It was covered by a thick canopy of evergreens, but it also had a great view of the mountains and also the lake. But Harry was not here to relax. He was actually on very high alert, because the woods were absolutely crawling with federal agents and local law enforcement officers. Harry could literally see them right now through his binoculars, walking around the various camps they had set up all over the mountainside and also near the lake. And there was nobody to stop them, because everybody else who lived in this forest had bowed to the pressure and left when told to, which meant Harry was quite literally the last resident still fighting the good fight.